Right, no pun intended, but volcanic wines are one of the hottest things in wine right now. But what is a volcanic wine, and what are the characteristics that you might find in the glass that would tell you it came from a volcanic soil? Well, today I'm tasting three wines from possibly the three most famous volcanic terroirs of all. I've got this one, a Palo Blanco from Tenerife. I've got this Carricante from the slopes of Mount Etna, and then I've got this Assyrtiko from the island of Santorini in Greece. So let's find out if there is such a thing as a volcanic expression in wine. And if there is, does it really come from the terroir, or is it actually just at the whim of the winemaker? Well, we're going to find out. So some of you might have seen the conversation that I had recently with Miguel Crunia on this idea of volcanicity in wine, specifically how much it's to do with these volcanic terroirs themselves, or how much of it is influenced actually in the cellar, particularly through reduction and reductive winemaking. So in other words, are the flavours that we might typically associate with these volcanic wines a result of the natural environment and the terroir? Or is it possible to actually just to cheat and artificially create this kind of style in the cellar? So that's what I want to explore in these wines. But before I get into all of that, there is so much misunderstanding in the wine world about reduction, what it is, what it does, where it comes from. I just want to spend a few minutes on the science of this and hopefully clear up a few of the more confusing issues in this topic. So, reduction. First thing to say about it is this is an incredibly technical and complex topic, and actually even amongst like actual science people who know about these things, there's quite a lot of the processes here are not fully understood. One of the key areas of confusion, I think, is that the chemical use of the term reduction is actually different from the way that it's come to be used in the wine trade. So in chemistry, reduction refers specifically to the gain of electrons, and oxidation refers to the loss of electrons. It's what's called the redox reaction, which confusingly may or may not involve oxygen. Anyway, in the wine trade though, we use it to refer to the presence of a whole suite of what we call volatile sulfur compounds, the most famous of which is hydrogen sulfide, or H2S. So there are different points at which you might introduce these reductive characteristics into the wine, both intentionally or unintentionally. The big one is during fermentation, when the yeast is doing its work and creating alcohol. It's also potentially going to be producing these volatile sulfur compounds. The next one is after fermentation, when the yeast dies, particularly during lees aging. And then the third one is actually after bottling, depending on the type of closure that you're using, screw caps, for example. I'll talk more about that maybe in a minute. But 99% of it is coming from yeasts. Yeasts are the really important things here. During fermentation, it gets very, very complicated. And I'm not going to even try and get into the weeds of it here. But basically, in layman's terms, if you've got really stressed yeasts, you're going to have more potential for the creation of hydrogen sulfide in the wine. And then hydrogen sulfide that is produced can then itself react to cause other aromas and other compounds in the wine. So there are various different things that might cause that stress of the yeast during fermentation. The first one is solids. So when you just crush your grapes, and juice that comes out is full of like bits and bobs floating around in it. And so you're going to want to clarify that must before fermentation. But the degree to which you clarify will affect the amount of solids. And if you've got more solids in your must, there's higher potential for creating a reductive environment and getting these volatile sulfur compounds. So that's one thing. The other thing is winemaking and particularly temperature. So cooler fermentation temperatures or big temperature fluctuations, the yeast has to work harder when it's colder. So you've got more potential again of producing these kinds of flavors. And then the third thing is nitrogen. So if you've got a deficiency of nitrogen in the must, that can also stress the yeast out and start to create these kinds of flavors. And it was interesting that Miguel, in our session on Tenerife soils, pointed towards the fact that volcanic soils often have quite low nitrogen, which could then have effect on the amount of called yeast assimilable nitrogen in the must. So anyway, it's an interesting idea. So that's during fermentation. Before I move on to the other areas where you might get these kinds of flavors coming in, I want to cover another couple of areas of confusion. One of them is the link between reduction and oxidation, because I think a lot of people think of these two terms as opposites, but they aren't. And it's possibly because of the kind of chemical, like official kind of chemical use of this term. It's possibly due to the fact that a lot of these volatile sulfur compounds often develop in environments that are low in oxygen, but it's not actually that causes it. So these are not opposites, and it's actually entirely possible to have a wine that is reduced and oxidized at the same time. And even I've heard of even occasionally some winemakers getting this wrong, where they'll see these reductive characters coming into their wine and they think, oh, we'll just bubble some oxygen through it, and they end up with a wine that is twice as faulty. So that's one thing. I'm slightly aware at this point that this might be the time when people's heads start spinning, in which case, here's a video of some baby goats. Okay, so we will get to the wines before too long, but there's another area of confusion that I want to try and clear up, and that is, while we're on the topic, sulfur versus sulfites versus sulfides, because people often think of these terms as interchangeable, and they're not. They chemically have very different properties. They're all used in winemaking, but they all do very, very different things. So sulfur, first of all, is an element. And it's used in a vineyard where it's used as kind of like yellow powder that's sprayed onto the vines predominantly as a fungicide. Sulfites, with a T, refers specifically to sulfur dioxide. Now, I'm not going to get into sulfur dioxide, but sulfur dioxide is an incredibly important additive that's used on just about every wine that you will try, primarily as an antioxidant. But that's not what we're talking about here. Sulfides, with a D, are what are important in this conversation, but they're not the only thing that's important. You've got sulfides, but you've also got other compounds like thiols and mercaptins that are an important part of the conversation about reduction. So the other two areas where you might introduce reductive characteristics into the wine are during lees aging and then your choice of closure after bottling. So lees aging, first of all, this is so after fermentation, the yeast will die, it'll fall to the bottom of whatever you're fermenting in. Lots of winemakers will choose to have a period of time where the wine remains in contact with the lees. But lees scavenge oxygen. And so this is one of the reasons why most winemakers will choose to do regular batonnage, where you whip up the lees and introduce it back into the wine and then let it resettle. You're also introducing oxygen. If you don't do that, you'll start to get these pockets of reduction where the wine meets the lees that can potentially be a bit problematic. The other one is closures, and particularly screw caps. Ever since we saw screw caps become so prevalent, we've had much higher instances of reduction, and it's to do with what we call the oxygen transmission rate, OTR, which basically means the amount of oxygen that can get from the outside of the bottle to the inside of the bottle. Cork has a much higher OTR than most screw caps, but even that now is not straightforward because screw cap technology has come on so much. But anyway, it's yeast that are really crucial. But one of the most interesting things about the yeast is that different strains of yeast have a very different ability to create these volatile sulfur compounds in the wine. And I think it's a really underexplored area of terroir. What's interesting about the three wines I'm going to taste is they are all made with indigenous yeasts that have been created in these volcanic environments. Could it be that they are the things that are most responsible for any sort of volcanic signature we find in the wine? I don't know. We'll get into it in a minute. Okay. Final thing on all of this, and well done if you're still here. Flavors. So there is good reduction and there's bad reduction, and bad reduction at its worst is definitely, unequivocally, a wine fault. Good reduction, though, can be flavors like struck match, which is particularly fashionable in lots of really top-end Chardonnays at the moment, but also sort of like a flintiness, maybe a minerality. There's actually a school of thought that says that most of the flavors that we associate with minerality are actually due to reduction. I definitely think there's some truth to that. But also some more exotic flavors like passion fruit or boxwood. These classic flavors you might find on something like a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc are actually really far more influenced by the yeast than a terroir of Marlborough. And then there's other things like a kind of like a smoky sort of coffee thing that can be quite nice. When it's bad, it drifts into this like stinky drains, like rotten eggs, cabbage, boiled onion kind of category, and it's kind of stinky and gross. But why are we talking about this here? Well, it's because a lot of the flavors that we might traditionally associate with volcanic wines arguably actually fall into this volcanic category. So without further ado, I'm going to try these 3 wines. I want to know if there are any consistencies between these 3 very different wines, different grape varieties, very different climates, that we could potentially put down to a volcanic soil, or whether or not there's more of a feeling that this stuff is coming from winemaking, or actually whether or not there is no consistencies here whatsoever. And I really don't know how this is going to go. This first wine, the Palo Blanco, that's this one from Tenerife. It's made by Envinate. I love it. I just think this is the most exceptional wine. I know it really well. The other 2 I haven't tried though. So we've got this one, Benanti. This is Contrada Rinazzo from Etna Superiore. And then we've got this one from Santorini, number 34. I'll put all of the details of the wines down below if you wanted to try them for yourself. So let's get into it then and see what we find with these wines. Okay, first up, this one. This is Palo Blanco. It's from the Orotava Valley in Tenerife. Palo Blanco grape variety. Same grape variety as Palomino Fino from Jerez, but in Tenerife it does maybe arguably slightly more interesting things than it does in Jerez. And if you have never tried a volcanic wine before, and you had to sort of have a guess at what you think it might smell and taste like, this Palo Blanco is probably where you're at, because on the nose, it's got this incredibly intense sulfury character. There's hardly any fruit. It's really lean, it's kind of green, it's a bit austere, and it's got this kind of really intense, smoky, flinty, minerally character that is so unique and so different that I find it just incredibly intriguing. Let's give this one a quick taste. Before we dive in, I want to talk about WSG membership. WSG membership brings together over 2,000 wine lovers from around the world, united by a passion for great wine. Our mission? To go beyond the textbook, exploring all the latest trends and developments across Europe's top vineyards and busting a few myths and stereotypes along the way. Members enjoy exclusive video content with expert interviews,
Marsan, a little bit smoother, more kind of yellow fruity.
Tasting sessions with our in-house masters of wine, live monthly webinars, and exclusive regional mini-series. You'll connect with fellow wine enthusiasts in our chat spaces and online tasting club, sharing wine tips, travel recs, and the odd lively debate. You'll also gain access to our groundbreaking producer guide, spotlighting the very best wines across France, Spain, Italy, and Germany, from the traditional, iconic estates to the new generation of talent snapping at their heels and writing the next chapters in the story of these regions. Plus, discounts on all our online certifications, priority booking on our industry-leading study tours, and a whole range of exclusive member perks. There's never been a more exciting time to join WSG membership. If you haven't signed up yet, well, you probably should. Join us now at winescholarguild.com/membership. Now let's get back to the video. I love this wine so much. Hardly any fruit on this wine at all. It's a bit citrusy, but really that's not what this wine is about. This is a textural wine. It takes you on a textural journey. You get this bitingly crisp, wonderful acidity that's so kind of Moorish. And then after that, it kind of pings around your mouth with this steely minerality that then itself evolves into this very, very distinctive salinity. There's a really pure saline character on this wine that is intriguing and unique, and the length on it is really super. There is certain wines that you come across that just get under your skin. And this is such a good example of that for me. I find it completely confusing and exciting and intriguing and quite magical, actually. If you come across it, actually any of the wines from Envinate are all superb. Give it a go, because it's absolutely super. Let's see how the other two compare though. Right, number 2, Carricante. I love Carricante. I think it is one of Italy's superstar white grape varieties. Smells very different. It doesn't have that immediate blast of sulfur that you get on the Tenerife wine. It's got a lot more fruit, which, I mean, they're different grape varieties, right? They're from different places. They're obviously going to taste very different, but I'm really interested in what's the same. And what's not the same is that it doesn't have that sulfury note that the first one had. However, what it does have on the nose is a more gentle struck match characteristic that is really nice, actually. It's really nicely done. It's really complexing. Let's see what it's like on the palate. So on the palate, it's one of those wines that slightly surprises you, actually, because it's nice and kind of ripe and fruity on the nose. On the palate, it's much more like this Palo Blanco. There's a real austerity and a restraint and a tension in this wine. It's also got this like really kind of pure acidity that cuts through the wine, just like it did on the first one. But I think the thing that is most similar about them is this mineral streak that both of them had. This is incredibly flinty. And again, it's got this really distinctive saline character that is similar, actually, to the first wine, even though it's a very sort of like different style, it's different shape of wine. It also has this just absolutely joyous, like roasted almond character that is like nothing really to do with volcanic wine, I suspect, but more to do with Carricante. But it's just like, it's a great wine, that if you want to try great Carricante, can't really recommend that. Third one, let's see how the Assyrtiko does. Okay, so Assyrtiko, island of Santorini. Assyrtiko is a much more aromatic grape variety anyway. Santorini is a lot warmer. Alcohol content of this is 14%, whereas it was only 12 in the other one. So, we've really going to find some differences here. And you get that on the nose. It's definitely the ripest and most fruit-driven of the three. It doesn't have any of that sulfury character on the nose, and it doesn't have any of that minerally character. There's really nothing in this wine from smelling it that sort of shouts that it comes from a volcanic terroir, or at least not typically how we might think of it. Let's see how it is on the palate. I absolutely love Assyrtiko. I think it's such a great grape variety. It does this thing where it's got this incredible richness and fatness and body and weight, but coupled with this almost like Riesling-like acidity that just cuts right through the wine. So the acidic structure on these three wines is actually very, very similar. So that's one thing they have in common. However, the thing that if we were to draw a consistent theme across these three wines is, again, this steely, saline minerality that is so present on that one and was so present on the other two as well. So three very, very different styles, but there are consistencies here between the three. So, key question then. Are these similarities that we found between these wines coming from the volcanic terroirs, or are they coming from the cellar? And I've just got my laptop here with some winemaking notes on here. So let me just run you through a few of these. The Palo Blanco, first of all, whole clusters are pressed, juice is left to settle overnight. So that suggests some sort of clarification of the juice, right? Fermented without skins in big old concrete tanks, indigenous yeasts, no temperature control. And then it's aged for in a big, massive, great big old oak fougere for 10 months. So there's nothing in there that really screams like full-on reductive winemaking. Carricante, grapes are destemmed, softly pressed, blah, blah, blah. Fermentation, again, natural yeast in stainless steel. The wine then matures for 12 months on its lees with frequent batonnage. And then the Assyrtiko, partial pre-fermentation maceration, so a bit of skin contact. 80% fermented in stainless steel, 20% in a mixture of old oak, concrete, and clay, and then it's aged on the lees again for 12 months. So there's nothing really in any of those three wines that is screaming, full-on reductive winemaking, although there is definitely influence of reductive yeast, particularly on wines 1 and 2 here. So what conclusions can we draw here then about the flavors of volcanic wines? I think that we need to be really careful. There are consistencies between these three wines. However, volcanic wine as a category is arguably fairly dicey. Well, it's not arguably, it is fairly dicey because there are lots of different types of volcanic soil. Like, it's not just one thing, it's a broad category of different soil types that are all going to influence the wine differently. And then I think we need to be really hesitant about ascribing particular soils to particular wines. However, I also think this is true of any soil, and volcanic soil is not unique. I mean, you can go to somewhere like Alsace and you can say, okay, we've got 3 different Rieslings that are grown on, granite versus limestone versus volcanic or whatever. And you can say, well, the granite Riesling is generally going to have these flavors, whereas limestone is going to be a bit softer and blah, blah. And it might kind of work. But if you go and do the same experiment with Chenin Blanc and Loire, you'll get an entirely different set of flavors. So I think that it's probably problematic to do that with any soil type, and I don't think we should necessarily hold volcanic wine to a higher standard than the other ones. Having said that, there is something in these 3 wines that, from my tasting experience, comes down to more than just reduction in the cellar. There is that balance and that poise and that tension and that saline minerality that is suggestive of something quite interesting. So that's it, guys. I mean, thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking with a fairly complex and heavy topic, but I hope that you've got something out of that and I hope you find it useful. If you've got any questions or any comments or any thoughts, please get involved in the comments because I'd love to hear from you, and really look forward to seeing you guys next time.